today's webcast, Retention Fundamentals and Execution. Before we get started today, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Epic. A global leader in the legal services industry takes on large-scale, increasingly complex tasks for corporate counsel, law firms, and business professionals with efficiency, clarity, and confidence. Clients rely on Epic to streamline the administration of business, operations, class action and mass tort, e-discovery, regulatory, compliance, restructuring, and bankruptcy matters. And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's presenter, Karen Frazier, who is a Senior Consultant Records and Information Management at Epic. Karen has over 20 years of experience in legal environment, both working directly for law firms and as a vendor for legal records solutions. Karen's experience includes process management and systems analysis, data mapping and migration, documentation and training. Karen designs and implements RIM programs to meet specific needs and goals of Epic's law firm clients. So without further ado, I am going to hand this presentation over to Karen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm Karen Frazier, and I am a Senior Consultant on Records Information and Management team for Epic. I began working for Epic in 2016, and at the time they were still DTI. I've been supporting our clients across the country and around the world with their various records initiatives. I've worked in the legal industry for over 20 years, mostly directly for law firms. And in the last 7 years, I've worked in a consulting capacity to help law firms with their records management needs. Prior to joining Epic, I worked for Revolution Software. There I developed and implemented software that could provide a workflow and process retention and disposition. I also performed migration between record systems and developed custom work and data flow solutions relating to record systems. While I was working at law firms, I held practically every non-billable position there is. I was a receptionist, a legal assistant, a records specialist. I was on the IT help desk, then became a database administrator and a web developer, and ultimately landed at business process development. That is my passion, business process improvement, and my focus is records and information. So enough about me. Let's get to our agenda for today. I have 3 topics for you today, all related to retention. First, we'll talk about the elements firms need to include in their records policy. I'll call it RIM from here on out, but I mean records and information management when I say that. Including these elements will ensure that your RIM policy is actionable and not just some elusive goal that is too overwhelming and impossible to execute against. Second, we'll talk about disposition strategies. You'll need to treat the sins of the past differently than you would your day-forward approach if you want to be successful. Lastly, we'll talk about how technology can really help to get to execution against your policy. Manually generating reports and doing line-by-line comparisons is too time-consuming to make a sufficient dent in your retention efforts. So you're going to need some tools that will help create efficiencies in your workflow. It's a lot to cover in an hour, but I'll stop after each topic and take any questions you have. So topic number 1, policy elements that support actionable retention execution. Here's an overview of Epic's approach to RIM and IG policy development. IG is another acronym like RIM. It stands for Information Governance. We take a 3-phased approach: build, develop, execute. First, we build out the required elements, and then we develop the supporting retention schedule and finalize the policy, and then we execute the policy. First, we'd have a kickoff call to share strategy, learn where your information lives in both physical and electronic format, and learn about any processes you have in place relating to those repositories. Then we would review any existing policies you might have, like a computer acceptable use policy or a new business intake policy. We'd also like to see any past attempts at a RIM and IG policy. Then we'd have a policy workshop to educate your key stakeholders on the key policy components they need to consider. These stakeholders are those at your firm who would be responsible for making policy decisions and enforcing policy directives. Once we've completed this initial diligence exercise, we can then begin drafting the policy itself. Our ultimate goal would be to come to a consensus of the key elements of the policy and then set a date to ratify the policy. For phase 2, we're doing the legal research for the retention schedule and presenting the draft policy to your stakeholders for review. Now, the retention schedules that inform the policy can be quite complicated. Many firms practice in multiple jurisdictions, both domestically and internationally. We don't consider ourselves to be experts on the retention requirements of every jurisdiction. This is where a specialist comes in. We use a third-party vendor for this, and this research into the retention requirements for domestic and international jurisdictions is their specialty. Once the jurisdictional, regulatory, and ethical requirements have been gathered, your firm's own business requirements and any of your client's business requirements are also included for consideration. You're then left with a comprehensive retention schedule that details both the minimum and maximum retention requirements that folds in all of these elements. Policy forums would then be held with your stakeholders to make final decisions about the retention schedule and the key policy elements. In the third phase, the firm ratifies the policy and communicates expectations to the firm at large. Typically, distribution of the policy would include an acknowledgement that needs to be signed by all members and employees, indicating their understanding of and intent to comply with the policy. It is a best practice to also include this acknowledgement for all new hires of the firm, to include it with any ongoing ethics training or any other annual training the firm requires. Now we'll talk a little bit more about what the purpose of a RIM and IG policy is. Here are some objectives that will help keep you on the path to actionable retention. The purpose of your policy is really to provide guidance to your lawyers and staff on how records and information should be managed. And the management of records and information needs to comply with all federal and state laws, regulations, and ethics rules. Third, you need to make sure your policy is actionable. What do I mean by that? One example is that it is a common practice for policies to state that a billing or responsible attorney has to approve any destruction of files through retention. What about that statement might make it unactionable? We all know that our attorneys need to bill time in order for the firm to be successful. Reviewing matter lists and boxes of files for destruction isn't a billable task, so it can very easily get backburnered and completely forgotten about. If your policy states the attorney must approve any file destruction and they don't get around to approval, your ability to execute against the policy is very diminished. So what can we do to make that policy statement actionable? One option is to require only a negative response from the attorney. Then the attorneys would only need to respond to the RIM team when they do not want eligible content to be destroyed. If the attorney does not respond within a designated period of time, we can then consider that an approval to destroy. In this way, we're still requiring attorney approval, but we have far more ability to execute. Our fourth item here is to focus on the policy, not the process. A lot of times, policy and procedure are intermingled in one document. This makes it really difficult to get to consensus because there are a lot of granular details to hash out. It also makes the need to update your policy a lot more frequent due to the potential changes in workflows and technology over time. Policy development is much more straightforward if you can focus on the what of the policy rather than the how. Determine what you want your policy to accomplish and then write separate procedure documentation that supports those ends. Lastly, this policy should not only reduce risk and cost to the firm, but also improve service to clients. Now that we've talked about the objectives, let's look at the look at the key components for a successful and actionable policy. Number one, you're going to want to apply it to all firm records, regardless of format. So hard copy folders and boxes, electronic documents, discovery collections, as well as email. Second, you'll want to include all firm offices, all practice groups, and all administrative departments. Third, the policy needs to set expectations for the organization of official files. Ideally, that they be in electronic format and organized by client matter number. You'll also want to specify that materials not meeting these expectations are subject to purging from firm systems. Retaining content in this manner simply creates too much risk for the firm. Next, you'll want to establish an official repository for the official file. Best practice is your document management system. Now, we know there are many attorneys that like to work with paper. We won't be successful implementing our policy if we try to prevent this. However, we can put parameters in place that specify that hard copy documents are convenience copies and do not need to be retained at the close of a matter. Fifth, here you're going to want to distinguish between what content is owned by the firm, what belongs to the client, and what belongs to the individual attorney. Next, we'll want to specify when matters will be eligible to be closed. If you aren't closing matters, how will the clock get started on the retention period? And you'll also want to define how long your records and information will be retained, and this would be defined in the retention schedule. Lastly, you'll need to decide what materials any lateral hire lawyers can bring into the firm and what materials departing attorneys can take with them. Here is a look at a sample table of contents for a RIM and IG policy. It covers everything we just talked about and also provides definitions to prevent ambiguity. It also sets the responsibilities of the different roles in the firm that will interact with or enforce the various policy components. We'll be talking next about disposition strategies, and client notification plays a big part in that. As for the policy itself, you'll want to specify your requirements for notifying clients that their files are going to be destroyed. A lot of firms wait to do this until after the files become eligible to be destroyed, but it is becoming more and more common, as well as more cost-effective, to clarify your retention policy in your engagement letter. For all of your already existing engagements, a matter closing letter can take the place of your engagement letter to notify your clients of your policy. If you combine these with a practice of returning client originals as soon as copies can be made, then these notifications eliminate the need to locate and notify clients years after matter closure, which is a time-consuming and expensive process. That does it for the policy topic. I'm going to pause here before moving on to the disposition strategies to take any questions you have for me.
Sure. I think we do have one question. I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions about topic one, go ahead and chat those to all participants or all panelists. But for now, we do have one question. Earlier, you mentioned that a policy can state that attorneys only have to provide a negative response for destruction of files. How long do firms typically give attorneys to provide a negative response?
That's a great question. 30 days is typical and reasonable. Generally longer if you're talking about client notification, and there you might want to do something like 60 days.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, I think we can move on to the next topic. I don't see any questions in the chat. Oh, well, we do have one. What are the risks of not disposing of documents?
So that's another good question. So the risk of not disposing of documents If we're talking about paper, the risk there is that it is discoverable. And if it's discoverable and it's very old, it can be taken out of context. The value of the information is lost. And you're going against your clients who may have their own retention policies and believe that these contents have been destroyed, and then to find out later that this content exists by the people that they trust, their attorneys, isn't great. If we're talking about electronic content, you have those risks again, and then you have the risk of the information, being subject to a data breach, which, your current information, you have those same risks. However, there definitely are greater risks of over-retention than there are of actually executing retention. So.
All right, great. So we've got one more question from Kevin. If you have matters that are no longer active but were not closed out previously, what is the best practice for determining the date for closing the matter? And he has an example, date of last billing.
Yeah, we actually will be talking about that a little bit in a later section. But with a few exceptions for certain practice areas like estate planning, where you would have a matter probably remain open until after a client has passed away, and maybe certain criminal cases where you've got minors involved, or certain statutes of limitations where you would want to leave these matters open a little longer. But for the most part, you could probably say anything that hasn't been billed in 12 to 24 months is probably subject to closure.
All right, good job. I think that's it on the questions for this topic.
All righty. Okay, so this next part is about defensible disposition strategy. We've created this awesome policy, now what? Are you going to have to wait 7 years or 10 years for content to be eligible before you can do anything? What about the thousands of boxes of files you have on site or in off-site storage today? And what constitutes defensible? Principle 6 of the Sedona Conference Commentary on Information Governance provides the following guidance. The effective, timely, and consistent disposal of physical and electronic information that no longer needs to be retained should be a core component of any information governance program. Further, the Sedona Conference Commentary on Defensible Disposition discusses 3 principles. Principle 1, absent a legal retention or preservation obligation, organizations may dispose of their information. Principle 2, when designing and implementing an information disposition program, organizations should identify and manage the risks of over-retention. Principle 3, disposition should be based on information governance policies that reflect and harmonize with an organization's information, technological capabilities, and objectives. So let's look at the day forward approach. In your day forward solution, this guidance, especially the guidance in Principle 6, to consistently dispose of information through the normal course of business, is much easier to implement. Plus, you're able to focus more on avoiding risk and cost in the first place rather than just cost savings. And the benefits of this multiply on down the road. You have the luxury day forward to include your retention policy in your client engagement letters. And you're able to send a matter closure or disengagement letter to clients upon the closing of a matter. You can't really do these things retroactively on your legacy content. Today, you're able to ensure that client originals get promptly returned after imaging, and you can make sure that your firm-owned content is separated from your client-owned and attorney-owned content. Your legacy files, well, they're going to be sprinkled with client originals and organized in whatever fashion the timekeeper or their assistant saw fit. You're able to train your firm on policy expectations and keep training them so that your policy directives are abided by. But your legacy content knew no such policy. You'll be able to consistently execute retention because your clients will have been notified, your attorney approval process is a breeze, and your files exist for the most part electronically, requiring very little cost or effort to dispose. Meanwhile, your legacy content consists of files of varying age, in mostly physical format, and may be questionably identifiable in offsite storage. And the clients they belong to are as likely to have moved, dissolved, or died as they are to be found at the last known address the firm has on file, which carries with it substantial effort and cost to dispose. You'll also be able to operationalize your policy and automate the identification of eligible content. The authorization for disposal and the disposal itself result in efficiencies of both time and cost. These things are not just possible, they're just not possible with legacy content in the varied states that it exists in. So how do we handle all of the legacy content? Here's some guidance from the ABA Rules of Professional Conduct. Rule 1.16, Section D states, upon termination of representation, a lawyer shall take steps to the extent reasonably practicable to protect a client's interests, such as giving a reasonable notice to the client, allowing time for employment of other counsel, surrendering papers and property to which the client is entitled, and refunding any advance payment of fee or expense that has not been earned or incurred. The lawyer may retain papers relating to the client to the extent permitted by other law. Reasonably practicable. This is how we can approach our legacy content. Unlike your day-forward approach, your legacy approach has to put the highest priority on mitigating cost to meet the standard of reasonably practicable. The most common reason for putting off legacy retention execution is determining whether or not you need permission from the client to destroy the file. When you became engaged with clients prior to the implementation of your RIM policy, you likely didn't spell out your retention policy in your engagement letter. This means that your firm would either have to commit to the cost of notification or accept the risk of not notifying them. There is a point of reducing returns on the value of information, as I mentioned in the question that was asked previously. Information that has aged well past its prime has virtually no value to your firm or your clients, and it could actually be creating risk due to the loss of context surrounding that information. With that in mind, we can chop up our legacy matters by age and take a different, reasonable approach to each age group. We'll therefore balance risk and cost. This is a big bucket approach to carving up your holdings into buckets according to the level of effort required while still being reasonable. First, we have the oldest content, 25 years or older. Then we have everything 11 to 24 years old, and one for everything that just met eligibility to 10 years old. There's one caveat with this approach. You'll want to research your state bar association's imperatives regarding firms' obligations relating to closed files. There may be state ethics opinions that provide differing guidance, and you will want to be sure to include those parameters in your practice. Let's look at the oldest content first, the stuff that's 25 years or older. This is the content where you are most likely to run into trouble with even identifying the content without getting it back from offsite storage and manually reviewing it. The records practices of the past were limited by both a lack of technology and a lack of consideration toward later destruction. Files were kept forever because storage was cheap, and if you ever needed to refer to something in the future, you had the luxury of knowing what you were looking for. Targeted searches of card catalogs were really the only practice. To identify content based on a data point as broad as matter close date wasn't something considered. And once you do recall a box from storage and manually review it, what is the likelihood that the client can be found at the last known address that the firm has, if the firm even has a record that this was ever a client at all? So to add to the expense of recalling the box and spending the time to review what's in it, you have additional cost in researching where to send a notification letter to. This can really add up over the entire collection. It's no wonder many firms have been content to just keep paying the monthly storage fees and maybe hope for a warehouse fire. Just kidding. So how should firms handle content in this age group? Well, what's reasonable and what is defensible? You can perform sufficient research to determine how many boxes of material fit this age range. If a paper card catalog is the only source of metadata about the contents of these boxes, it's not reasonable to expect a full review of the card catalog. But it would be reasonable to look at offsite storage vendor reports to identify the date content was originally sent offsite. And if your firm has gone through a series of offsite storage vendors and your current vendor doesn't track that original metadata, we can look to other forms of analysis, which I'll discuss in the next topic. Once you identify how many boxes you have that have been off-site at least 25 years, you're going to want to start a marginal review of that material. This means 1% of the content needs to be pulled back and reviewed. This should be done at random rather than on a series of boxes. You'll want to look at the content and determine its makeup, paying particular attention to whether it contains anything that would give you pause on destruction, like original stock certificates or trademark documents. What you find determines your level of risk and destruction of these contents. If you find the risk tolerable, you have then spent significantly less resources in both time and expense, and you can instruct your offsite storage vendor to destroy these contents without any further review. You will have wiped out your oldest and least valuable content in relatively easy fashion, the reasonableness being justified by the cost savings, the cost still being significant, as offsite storage vendors generally make a solid buck off the destruction. But you are saving the additional recall fees and the cost of the resources reviewing all of the contents. As for notifying clients, because of the relatively high rate of inability to locate clients of this age, you may consider notifying only those clients with which you still do business on other matters. A letter indicating that pursuant to your newly ratified retention policy, you have destroyed all content older than 25 years, and therefore content related to the client would have been included. And this is not just asking for permission or detailing contents, but it's just a courtesy notification. Now let's look at the content that is 11 to 24 years old. This line in the sand may need to be more flexible in your environment. For instance, you may have still been tracking files on a card catalog up until 20 years ago. So maybe the reasonability of the content review from 20 to 24 years old would fall under the oldest and least valuable content we just talked about. But generally, at least 20 years ago, firms started tracking their records more electronically. Hopefully your firm falls into this generalization because electronic tracking definitely makes the analysis and review of content more reasonable. If you're relatively new to the world of electronic tracking of records, then you'll need to really weigh the risks against the cost of this more comprehensive, though not exhaustive, review. In this bucket of content, you likely have more metadata points available to you to aid in your review, and you're more likely to have better access to understanding the contents of boxes without recall of the box for review. You're also more likely to have all of these clients and matters accounted for in your financial software, so you're able to target matter close dates if you've been using them. If not, you can still fall back on the date sent off-site to compile your collection. In this review, you'll want to recall about 2 to 3% of the collection for review. Now here, you're not only looking for content that you would not want to destroy, like the stock certificates I mentioned before, but you'll want to confirm that these boxes actually contain the content your data sources say they do. If the source does not accurately reflect the content of the boxes, you may want to perform a more comprehensive review. Again, taking the age of the contents into consideration, since the older the content, the less likely it is to have any value. With this content, you are also more likely to be able to locate clients, although sometimes it can still be problematic. You'll want to use the last known address that you have, and then determine what level of risk you are willing to take on if the mail is returned undeliverable. Will you perform research to locate the client? What level of effort are you willing to undertake to do so? To be defensible, you must be consistent, so be sure to take the same approach for all undeliverable mail. For this bucket, you may want to give your clients the option of having contents returned to them, or else the content would be destroyed. So be sure to word your not getting a response back wouldn't hinder your ability to destroy. Give your clients a period of time within which to respond, and if they don't, go ahead and proceed with destruction. Again, if you can trust the contents of the boxes without manual review, you can have your storage vendor perform this destruction for you. If you can't be confident in your inventory, you may want to take the approach of just notifying the clients that the content was destroyed pursuant to your newly implemented retention policy, and then assure them that matters closed after X date, which would be subject to a more comprehensive review, will be offered up for return to them if desired. Here, we'll take a look at the newest content, everything 10 years old and newer. This content has the highest risk of containing information that still has some value. So the most effort should be expended here. You're going to want to pull lists of matters that are eligible for destruction and identify the folders being stored for those matters. Send a similar notification to clients as for the 11 to 24-year group, making sure you can destroy the content in the event the client does not respond. These are the matters for which you can provide the most information in your client notifications, so you should offer the files be returned to the client in lieu of destruction. Every box should be reviewed to ensure that it contains nothing that should not be destroyed. The likelihood that content in this bucket may be mixed with files not yet eligible for destruction is much higher. This may seem like a daunting effort, but many offsite storage vendors provide review rooms that allow you to send teams over to review boxes without the expense of recalling them to your office. Equip your review teams with a list of boxes that can reasonably be reviewed in a single day. And for the boxes that contain only files that have been authorized by the client to be destroyed, either affirmatively or passively through non-response, the review team can instruct the offsite storage vendor to destroy the boxes. Where they find boxes containing files not eligible for destruction, they can remove that content, consolidating other eligible content into the boxes to be destroyed, and content not eligible into other boxes. If it is not possible to access your records management system from these offsite review rooms, instead, your review teams may want to recall those mixed content boxes back to the office for consolidation, where they can ensure the record system is updated appropriately. And I'll stop here again to take questions. It looks like we have several on the books.
You do. I'll go with the first one, which states we have attorneys who won't close files because they know that means that down the road, the paper and electronic data will be deleted, and they'll no longer be able to refer back to the file when they have a similar matter come up. So how do you deal with that?
So that is actually another concept that firms are beginning more and more to start embracing is the concept of a knowledge management system. And this is something, with information governance, you're going to want to be able to build upon your best and greatest work for similar cases. And so you would want to create a repository there that, of course, redacts client information in whatever way possible so that you're not over retaining information, but it creates a great template for future work that needs to be done.
Okay, great. And then Brenda wants to know, would you still apply the destruction process to estate plans that are 25 to 40 years old?
If you have a way to identify that content, or if you feel that you have content that is estate planning related, I would not destroy that content without a thorough review, ensuring that you don't have original will and testaments, trust files, and the like inside.
Okay, great. And then just one last one. When sending clients notification that files will be destroyed, do you send certified mail?
That is a very expensive and time-consuming process. I don't recommend certified mail. It can save your firm hundreds of thousands of dollars to do regular U.S. mail.
All right. Great. Just one more. What level of research do firms typically do to locate clients when notifications come back undeliverable?
So that's a good one. So the older the content, the harder to find, but is it worth it based on the age? So a Google search is free. A Secretary of State search is free. If it's newer, maybe it's done in Bradstreet, but you typically, that's a subscription that you pay for. Some firms have to pay by the search. I would say that if you can consistently say, I've done a Google search and I've done a Secretary of State search for any businesses, and you can send out a new mail if you find any newer addresses, and if it comes back undeliverable again, you've done all that's reasonable.
All right, great. I think that's it for questions for topic 2.
All right. Moving on. Okay, our last topic for this session is on supporting technology and how to leverage it. This is the part that really makes the wheels go round. Some technology requires investment in software, while others require investment in know-how. All of these considerations, your big bucket analysis, your destruction approval, your client notification, the analysis of how much of what's in your boxes is actually eligible and authorized, and the execution of disposition against your electronic holdings. All of these become more actionable, consistent, and defensible with the help of technology. I have in-depth experience with both designing technology and workflows that accomplish retention execution, as well as performing back system analysis to efficiently and cost-effectively target content. We've mostly been talking about physical content when we talk about your legacy approach to disposition. But we can't ignore the fact that there is very likely content associated to your legacy, electronic content associated to your legacy content as well. This content must also be destroyed in order to fully execute retention. Data in your document management system, if you're not matter-centric, can be manually destroyed. You really should have your DMS configured to be matter-centric, though. That's beyond the scope of this webinar, so we won't discuss that any further. But legacy data in a matter-centric environment can also very easily be destroyed, even if retention rules have not been applied on the content. That's the benefit of a matter-centric environment. You can target a matter, and with the administrative privileges of the system, destroy all of the targeted content within. For your day-forward approach, if your system is capable, I manage a NetDocsR for sure, and there are others as well, but those are the two biggest players right now. You can create retention rules and apply them to your content. In this way, you can programmatically execute retention on your electronic content. It's a two-factor approach preventing unauthorized destruction of data. First, the item must be eligible for destruction according to the retention rule applied for it, like the matter has been closed for more than 7 years. And second, the designated attorney must indicate authorization. You can even implement a three-factor approach in that the records manager or DMS administrator must indicate the final authorization. These systems have the built-in ability to track the disposition activity from approval to destruction, so the process is entirely auditable. So what about all of the electronic data that lives outside of the document management system? Well, structured data is really all that can be reasonably disposed of without an in-depth review of content. Your firm may decide it wants to designate resources to review that content and migrate it to the DMS, or potentially invest in auto-classification software. Auto-classification software is cutting-edge technology and quite expensive, and again, outside of the scope of this webinar. But for the content that it is in structured repositories, such as on an e-discovery platform, or in a client matter organized SharePoint library, or even on a network share in a predictable client matter format, you can have designated personnel in your IT or records department generate an index of the directory content for future auditability, and then delete the content under the authorized matters. Of course, this is a manual process for your legacy content, but you won't have to contend with this issue with your day-forward approach, because all of your official client matter file content will reside in your document management system, quite possibly with the only exception being the content on your e-discovery platform. As we've discussed, client notification can be a huge undertaking in and of itself. So let's talk about ways you can save on at least some of that effort. Your financial system can provide last known addresses for clients. However, looking up each client individually to obtain that address information consumes valuable time and resources. If your system is capable, you may be able to obtain a report on all client addresses within a certain matter close date range. If your system isn't capable of producing such a report, I know a few ways to obtain that data through read-only access on a back-end accounting database, and would be able to generate such results to a handy-dandy Excel file in the perfect format to use in a mail merge. You can create a form letter with all of the necessary merge fields, including, if you'd like, a listing of all the eligible matters for the client. Once you use the form letter as a template for the mail merge with the exported Excel data, you've just produced a mass mailing in a fraction of the time and cost needed to manually generate these letters. Of course, unless you have some pretty heavy-duty mass marketing and mailing equipment, you're still going to need to utilize the time and resources to fold the letters, stuff them into envelopes, and run them through the postage machine to get them out the door. Another huge part of retention execution is the workflow to get destruction approved. It can be very time-consuming for your records team to compile lists of eligible matters attorney by attorney. iManage and FileTrail have offerings that can compile these lists and submit them electronically to attorneys for approval. But what if you aren't on either of these systems? Many of you are operating on legacy record systems that have been end-of-lifed and not only are no longer supported by the vendors, but never offered any or offered very little in the way of retention management. If you're in this boat, we can help you there as well. I've used whatever back-end resources are available to me to compile the list of eligible matters, put them in a pretty report to distribute to attorneys, track the approval process at both the attorney and client level, and track the ultimate disposition of the content, reporting in real time on the throughput, even creating forecasting models to show the man-hours required to process the contents of both the current retention effort as well as future retention efforts. So your firm can make informed decisions about the resources it will choose to utilize to complete the retention process and how much time it can expect that to take to do so. I can use SQL and Access databases, Crystal reports, SQL Server reporting services, really, like I said, whatever is available to me in your environment to create such a workflow. Let's talk about big bucket analysis. What I'm talking about here is a look at your record system, most likely through the back-end database, because most systems do not provide an easy way to marry your matter level data with your file level data. In other words, you can get a list of the matters that are eligible to be destroyed based on their matter close date, but you would have to look at the file index of each matter one by one in order to see what files exist for it. So why would it be important for you to be able to see the files for each eligible matter? One of the end goals from this analysis is to provide a list of matters to your attorneys for their authorization, and then to notify your clients of the impending destruction of their files. If you can't readily see whether your matters actually have files associated to them, it's a bit like crying wolf. You might provide a list of matters to an attorney for their review, and they may come back and say something like, didn't we transfer all of this content back to the client in 2015? Or, I thought we destroyed everything for this matter pursuant to the client's request in 2013. Are you telling me we didn't do that? And then you look at the file index for that one matter, and you can see that, yes, indeed, we did transfer all the files to the client, or we did destroy all the content. This inspires a lack of confidence in your process and may even undermine your day-forward retention efforts if your end users don't trust your management of their content. Another benefit is that it can really pare down the list of matters needing to be reviewed by your attorneys. If you can eliminate from the list all of the matters for which all files have already been dispositioned in one fashion or another, then the list is that much less overwhelming for your attorneys. It also saves the attorney and the firm the embarrassment of sending a client notification and having the client reply back that they would like their files returned to them. But when you look up the matter's file index in the system to recall it all for shipment, you find that nothing exists. Then you have to go back to the client and say, never mind, we don't have anything to give you, sorry about that. That inspires confidence. Many times, an analysis of the record system alone is not enough. It may be sufficient for the newest eligible content, but is less likely the older the content is. Plus, in many cases, firms don't, or at least didn't before they implemented their actionable RIM and ID policy, they weren't consistently closing matters when engagements concluded. There could be a ton of content out there that is not even being considered because the retention clock had no way to be started. So we can take a look at the financial system to see when the last billed date was for open matters and whether there's currently any AR balances or WIP, work in progress yet unbilled. We can then provide the accounting department with a list of matters that can be closed based on the last billed date. And they can close those matters effective today or retroactively, effectively starting the retention clock and creating an additional pool of eligible content to destroy. For the oldest content, an additional dive into the offsite storage vendor holdings is warranted. Most vendors can provide an inventory report with additional metadata showing the original date of receipt and the last retrieval date, and they can provide it in Excel format. If you have gone through several offsite storage vendors over the years, we'll want to look at their final inventory reports upon transfer to the new vendor to ensure that we can identify the original date of archive. And we only need to go back so far on that, right? Once we hit that 20 or 25 year mark, we know everything else is older than that and belongs in that bucket of oldest content. For the most efficient analysis, we would want to convert anything not in Excel format to Excel, clean it up, and then import it to a database like SQL or Microsoft Access for efficient review. Through all of these methods, we can get a pretty clear picture of the division of your holdings between the buckets, allowing you to begin executing retention by targeting the lowest hanging fruit, then moving on through to the contents requiring the most effort. Lastly, we have the box content analysis. This is something that none of the records management systems are doing, except maybe FileTrail, and if so, then it's a really new offering. Box content analysis probably will single-handedly save your firm the most money. By reviewing the records management database, I can determine all of the contents accessioned to a box, and then identify which of that content is eligible and authorized for destruction. If the box is comprised only of eligible and authorized content, and it has no rogue ineligible files sharing space inside it, then you can have your offsite storage vendor destroy that box for you without the need to recall it for review and consolidation. This saves a ton of money in box recall fees. Additionally, by understanding how much content within a single box is eligible, you're able to target those boxes with a higher percentage of eligible and authorized content to recall for review, which gives you much more bang for your buck on the recall fees. The analysis can also be combined with forecasting data. So if you have a box where only a couple of files within are eligible, and you don't want to spend the money or the resources on recall and review for 2 measly files, you can look to see if the percentage of eligible files would increase with next year's retention effort or the year after, and make informed decisions as to what content you can put off for a later, more worthwhile effort. Some final thoughts I'll leave you with before I take some more questions. With a RIM and IG policy in place and a big bucket approach to legacy retention, you can create a realistic and reasonable plan to destroy your content. It is definitely doable. Technology can really ease the burden. If you are already on or plan to migrate soon to a record system that can manage the destruction approval workflow, your efforts to process retention will be greatly reduced. Of course, if you're not on these systems, I'm here to help ease that burden as well. Having the knowledge of the structure of the back ends of these systems and understanding how to leverage the data that can come out of them is priceless. Well, maybe you can put a price on it, but the return on investment will be huge. Lastly, it's clear skies and smooth sailing ahead for your day-forward approach if you took the time to create a comprehensive RIM and IG policy, one that limits the number of locations and formats an official file can exist in. The retention process will be automated and can practically run itself. Do we have any final questions?
I don't see any just yet, but I do have one question here. If a firm wants to use the last billed date to close a matter in the system, how long since last billed do firms typically use to close a matter?
Depending on the practice area, it's 12 to 24 months. You're going to have exceptions like estate matters and intellectual property, some criminal cases, but generally 12 to 24 months is acceptable.
Okay, great. So we do have one from Ernestine. Partners are more willing to destroy off-site paper files knowing that we have electronic backup. Is it necessary to destroy the electronic versions?
Absolutely. You haven't actually executed retention if the content still exists in any form. So this is still over retention of materials.
Great. So if any of our attendees have any questions, please chat to all participants or all panelists. We've got one from Lindsay. Once the retention period ends, do you keep a record of what was destroyed? For example, the closing sheet detailing the client name, letter sent, etc.
Absolutely. You want to have an auditable process in order for it to be defensible. For any reason, if it's ever called into question, why you destroyed something, when you destroyed something, how you destroyed something, you will have this to fall back on. And most of these record systems today can provide you this audit of the process. You'll want to be able to point to your policy and say, I did this according to what my policy states through the normal course of business. And as long as you can prove that you consistently have done that, then you have defensible disposition.
All right, great. And just a reminder to everyone, this recording will be available later today with a link to a PDF of the slides on the Legal Marketplace website landing page, and we'll send an email out to everyone tomorrow as well. Do you have a sample language for notifying clients of destroying files?
We do have some sample language that we can share.
All right. All right, is there any other questions? We currently use NetDocuments for online storage. I believe you mentioned that there is a way to set it up to remove documents after a certain amount of time.
Yes, NetDocs is one of those systems that is highly configurable. So you can definitely set up retention rules to destroy your content after it meets certain requirements.
All right, great. All right, if anyone has any additional questions, please chat those to all participants or all panelists. And if we don't see any, Karen, is there anything else that you'd like to leave us with today? Well, we do have one more. Let's take this one real quick. Is it okay to make an electronic copy and immediately destroy the hard copy?
I would definitely take that approach for your legacy content that is not yet eligible to be destroyed, and that electronic copy then becomes your official file, part of your official file. And when it is eligible to be destroyed, you're definitely going to want to destroy that electronic copy as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. I think that might be it. We are coming pretty close to the top of the hour. Karen, if you wanted to kind of leave us with something real quick, and we'll go ahead and close us out for today.
Yeah, thank you so much to ALA, and thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your day to listen to me speak on this topic. I do hope that you found it engaging and useful.
And this was a great webcast. Thank you so much, Karen. We want to thank you for spending your time today presenting to us, and we also want to thank EPIC as well. We want to thank our attendees for joining us today, and again, we will be providing a recording of this webcast tomorrow. So this actually concludes today's webcast. Thank you all for attending. The recording will be available at legalmarketplace.alanet.org. We will send all registrants an email tomorrow with this link, and please visit our event calendar to sign up for future webcasts. Thank you all. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.